In the halls of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, a small clay fragment is carefully preserved under the strict catalog number CBS 10424. This piece of fired clay, no larger than a modern smartphone, is completely covered with a dense grid of ancient cuneiform characters. On its fragile surface, neat lines of text are carefully imprinted, a text that modern academic scholarship traditionally classifies as the Curse of Agade. The edges of this tablet appear quite jagged and chipped, as if it had been forcibly torn from a Linger library archive during some long-forgotten cataclysm. When viewed under the dim museum lighting, the deep grooves of the cuneiform script cast tiny shadows, making this incredibly ancient text truly three-dimensional and vivid. This unique tablet was discovered during large-scale excavations of the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur in modern-day Iraq in the late 19th century. Today, the site consists of nothing more than a series of dusty sand dunes located about 100 miles southeast of Baghdad. American workers extracted this artifact from completely dry soil, after which it crossed the ocean and ended up in laboratories in the United States. This fired clay records in detail the history of the fall of a mighty empire that completely dominated Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago. The narrative in the document is told from the perspective of traumatized witnesses who are desperately trying to make sense of the sudden and absolute destruction of their familiar civilized world. I stared at this artifact, covered in the dust of centuries, for a very long time before I allowed myself to ask one perfectly obvious question. The text on the tablet describes with frightening precision the use of a divine weapon that literally reduces developed cities to the finest dust. It explicitly mentions a blinding radiance that burns absolutely everything in its path, and a land that has forever lost its ability to bear fruit. Historians and linguists have long been accustomed to reading these lines exclusively as a poetic metaphor describing a common military conflict or a protracted climatic drought. But the incredible detail of the physical damage in this particular text forces one to seriously consider a completely different source of inspiration for the ancient Mesopotamian scribe. If you read the scholarly translation of this document carefully, you will immediately notice the strange technical precision of all the ancient descriptions of the catastrophe. The author does not merely speak of the trivial destruction of buildings. He meticulously records the irreversible change in the physical state of the soil itself and the local water bodies. The text mentions thermal processes that are very difficult to observe under ordinary domestic or military conditions of the early Bronze Age. Classical swords, bronze spears, and even the most intense urban fires always leave behind a perfectly clear and predictable archaeological trace. However, ancient cuneiform inscriptions persistently recount an event that instantly scorched the earth into a completely lifeless desert, unsuitable for agriculture. Historically, we have become accustomed to viewing all ancient authors as impressionable dreamers, prone to grossly exaggerating any large-scale natural phenomena. This convenient paradigm has become deeply entrenched in the scientific community and has served as a reliable intellectual filter for analyzing absolutely all historical documents of antiquity. When a Sumerian scribe explicitly mentions a destructive fire from the heavens, we automatically interpret this as a beautiful metaphor for ordinary summer heat. When he describes in detail the molten city stones, we imagine only a poetic exaggeration used to heighten the dramatic effect. But such a systematic approach completely deprives us of the opportunity to see the real physical anomalies that may have been meticulously documented by eyewitnesses. Consider this historical problem from the perspective of modern forensic science, which always seeks rigorous physical corroboration of any witness's testimony. If a witness under oath describes a fire, we will certainly look for a layer of gray ash and charred wooden support beams right at the scene of the incident. If they speak of a catastrophic flood, we reasonably expect to find deep layers of silt and characteristic aquatic sediments in the geological section. The main problem with the small CBS 10424 plaque is that it describes, step by step, the consequences of an anomalous thermal effect of incredibly high intensity. Until very recently, science simply did not have a physical location on the map that could be matched to this text. The situation changed dramatically when international archaeologists began extensive excavations in Jordan, in the hot valley of the Jordan River. There lies the vast ancient settlement of Tel El Hammam, covering a total area of about 85 acres on an elevated plateau. This fortified city flourished at the very same time that texts similar to the enigmatic Curse of Agade were being composed in distant Mesopotamia. Scientists systematically and carefully excavated the historical layers of soil to understand exactly how people lived, built, and traded in this rich region. They reasonably expected to find the standard historical pattern of slow development followed by the gradual decline of a typical Bronze Age Middle Eastern settlement. Instead of this standard picture, the researchers suddenly encountered a geological anomaly that forced them to urgently bring in physicists and mineralogists. A few feet underground, they discovered a strange mixed layer of debris, the thickness of which reached nearly 5 feet in some places. This dense layer contained more than just ordinary ash from a city fire or the mundane remains of collapsed walls made of unfired clay bricks. The team carefully extracted thousands of pieces of broken pottery from the ground, the outer surfaces of which had literally been transformed into greenish, bubbly glass. Lying nearby were large fragments of building bricks, which had also been exposed to extreme temperatures and melted on one side. When these strange samples from Tel El Hammam reached modern university laboratories, the results of the very first analyses left the technicians completely baffled. The data obtained irrefutably indicated that the ancient city had been destroyed by an event that went far beyond the capabilities of the time. Physical evidence, frozen in stone, pointed to an instantaneous release of colossal thermal energy, capable of melting hard minerals in a fraction of a second. This discovery prompted many researchers to revisit the ancient cuneiform texts, which for thousands of years had been regarded as nothing more than beautiful, terrifying fairy tales. Two completely parallel lines, academic linguistics and rigorous geological physics, unexpectedly began to converge at a single specific point. We have in our hands a translated ancient text describing the total thermal destruction of an entire region by some blinding divine weapon. And we have a real archaeological site in the Middle East, showing traces of thermal melting that cannot physically be explained by a bonfire or a furnace. This ancient clay tablet poses a direct question to each of us. What exactly did people in antiquity observe and record? To objectively understand this, we will have to set aside our usual historical concepts and look very closely at the raw laboratory data. Let's trace this incredible journey from a fragile cuneiform archive to electron microscopes without jumping to conclusions until the very end. Academic history always strives to find the simplest and most rational explanation for any, even the most massive, destruction of ancient cities. According to the official position of leading universities, the destruction of large settlements at the end of the Middle Bronze Age was caused by a combination of entirely ordinary earthly factors. Historians confidently speak of massive earthquakes, which were often accompanied by secondary urban fires caused by overturned hearths and broken oil lamps. When it comes to the sudden disappearance of an entire empire, such as Akkad, the theory of gradual climate change and prolonged drought comes into play. These natural disasters, compounded by inevitable invasions by neighboring nomadic tribes, form the classic picture of the collapse of the ancient world without any anomalies. As for documents such as the Curse of Agade, mainstream philology views them exclusively through the lens of the ancient literary genre of lamentation. Scholars argue that ancient authors simply lacked the necessary vocabulary to describe the complex political or economic crises of their era. Therefore, they resorted to hyperbole, attributing the wrath of the gods and the use of heavenly fire to quite ordinary military defeats or crop failures. The total destruction of the earth in the texts is interpreted simply as a severe famine year that led to starvation and the temporary abandonment of once fertile agricultural lands. This allows historians to comfortably categorize any mentions of anomalous weapons as the product of the religious imagination of frightened and traumatized witnesses. This scholarly interpretation is well-founded and built on decades of painstaking work with thousands of other similar cuneiform texts. Ancient rulers did indeed constantly exaggerate their victories and disasters for propaganda purposes, seeking to instill awe in their numerous subjects. The use of vivid metaphors, such as rivers flowing with blood or the heavens falling to the earth, was an absolute standard of the poetry of that time. Moreover, the Jordan River Valley, where Tel El Hammam is located, lies directly on the Great Rift Valley. Seismic activity in this unstable region is a proven fact, and major earthquakes have indeed wiped local settlements off the face of the earth on more than one occasion. We must acknowledge that mainstream science has done a tremendous job of constructing this logical and consistent model of the ancient world. A rational approach protects us from slipping into endless conspiracy theories about aliens every time we find a ruined clay foundation. The search for earthly causes for earthly events is the foundation upon which all of modern archaeology stands, and this foundation holds true in 99 out of 100 cases. If a wall fell, it was most likely toppled by an earthquake or a battering ram from an advancing enemy army, and certainly not by a mysterious laser beam. That is precisely why the initial reports on the excavations in Jordan classified the layer of destruction as the result of a strong but entirely standard seismic shock. But this neat and comfortable historical model falls apart when we begin to closely examine the specific physical details from laboratory reports. The theory of a powerful earthquake followed by an urban fire perfectly explains the collapsed walls and charred grain silos in residential neighborhoods. However, it is completely unable to explain the presence of microscopic spheres of molten glass that were found throughout the vast area of the destroyed city. These tiny glass beads form only when solid rock vaporizes in the air and then rapidly cools as it falls back to the ground. An ordinary fire fueled by wood or olive oil physically lacks the mechanism to create such complex aerodynamic shapes from molten rock. The breaking point of the official version lies not in the texts, but in the dry figures of thermodynamics, which cannot be ignored or interpreted ambiguously. The most intense fire in the ancient city, even with strong winds and a large amount of combustible material, reaches a maximum of 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This is quite enough to scorch clay or melt soft copper or lead, but completely insufficient to alter the structure of solid minerals. Earthquakes, no matter how destructive they may be, do not generate any open thermal radiation capable of melting bricks on one side. Thus, the official narrative collapses in the face of a single physical parameter recorded by instruments from independent university laboratories. We are talking about the specific temperature required to trigger the melting processes observed in the Tel El Hammam layer. To melt the mineral zircon, grains of which were found inside the vitrified ceramics. An instantaneous temperature exceeding 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit is required. This is nearly twice the maximum limit of any known natural fire or eruption of a typical volcano in this geological region. Such a monstrous temperature is comparable to the conditions inside an industrial smelting furnace, but in Jordan, it affected an area of 85 acres simultaneously. We are faced with an energy paradox that classical archaeology attempts to resolve using tools simply unsuited to such a scale of energy. When researchers point to this figure of 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit, traditional science often attempts to propose local alternatives. For example, a hypothesis is put forward regarding a direct lightning strike, which could hypothetically have struck a specific house and melted the sand around it. Another popular theory suggests an explosion in a large pottery kiln where combustible gas had accumulated due to a defect, causing a powerful local blast. But these explanations, however creative they may be, always stumble over the scale of the distribution of vitrified materials across the entire hill. Lightning can create a thin fulgurite in the sand over an area of a few inches, but it cannot burn an entire city to a glassy state. This is precisely where the main conflict arises between the desire to preserve the old paradigm and the need to acknowledge new physical facts. We have a layer of destruction that looks as if it had been placed in a giant microwave oven for a fraction of a second. And we have an official explanation that stubbornly continues to call this event simply an unusually intense fire following an earthquake. The difference between the temperature of a campfire and a temperature of 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit is not just a statistical error, it is a chasm between two different laws of physics. To bridge this chasm, we need to examine every piece of evidence discovered individually, starting with the most basic archaeological findings. The official version has honestly served its purpose, compelling us to seek the simplest answers before moving on to the complex ones. But when simple answers directly contradict the laws of thermodynamics, the stubbornness in defending them ceases to be a scientific method and becomes dogma. We are faced with the necessity of acknowledging that in 1650 BCE, something occurred in the Middle East that went beyond the scope of earthquakes. And to understand the nature of this event, we must turn to the first physical clue that caused scientists to sound the alarm. Let's take a look at exactly what archaeologists unearthed from beneath 5 feet of tightly compacted dead soil. The archives of the Trinity University Archaeological Expedition in the southwestern United States hold hundreds of plastic bags containing fragments of ancient pottery. These samples were extracted from the Tel El Hammam destruction layer, located just 8.6 miles northeast of the Dead Sea coast. Large-scale excavations at this specific site began in early 2005 and continue to this day under strict academic supervision. Mainstream science initially claimed that the charred shards found were a common result of a catastrophic fire that destroyed the Bronze Age settlement. This interpretation is quite plausible, as invaders often burned cities they had captured, and the wooden roofs of the houses produced a thick layer of black ash. But upon closer examination of these specific samples under a microscope, it becomes evident that something in this theory simply does not add up. A typical urban fire leaves pottery soot-stained or, at worst, cracked from prolonged exposure to intense furnace heat. However, the shards from Tel El Hammam have a layer of smooth, greenish glass about 1 millimeter thick on their outer surface. This process of transforming clay into glass, known as vitrification, occurred so rapidly that the inner layers of the pottery remained completely untouched by the heat. To achieve this effect, the object must be exposed to an extremely high temperature for a matter of milliseconds, after which the heating must be stopped instantly. Of particular interest is the strictly directional nature of this extreme melting, documented in the archaeological team's official reports. The vitrified surface on the bricks and pieces of jugs is always found on only one side, as if a giant blowtorch had been directed at them. Moreover, excavations revealed that all the melted sides face strictly in one direction, southwest. If the city had simply burned as a result of an earthquake, the heat sources would have been randomly distributed across all the burning streets and houses. The directional melting points directly to a single, external, and incredibly powerful source of thermal radiation that flared up over the city. Even stranger is the absence of any impact crater within this vast 85-acre excavation site. If the source of heat at 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit had been caused by the direct impact of a massive meteorite, we would have seen a giant crater in the ground. But the layer of destruction lies perfectly flat, covering the remains of building foundations with a dense blanket of mixed ash, bones, and molten brick. This physical contradiction stumped geologists for a long time, until they began analyzing the chemical composition of this glass layer. The expedition reports document the presence of strange metallic inclusions within the glass itself, which by nature should not be there. In the research team's official publication, the following term is used verbatim to describe the condition of these findings: ultra-high-energy thermal shock. This term describes a situation where a material is exposed to such high temperatures that its outer structure boils before the inner part has time to heat up. Finding such pieces of ceramic is like discovering the remains of tableware at a test site in Nevada after tests conducted in the 1940s. You're looking at an object that, a millisecond ago, was an ordinary cereal bowl and then encountered the surface temperature of the sun. And this bowl is just the first clue in a long list of anomalies found beneath the soil in Jordan. In-depth analysis of microscopic particles from Tel El Hammam was conducted at several independent research centers, including laboratories at Northern Arizona University. Scientists led by Dr. Bunch published their shocking findings in the peer-reviewed journal, Nature Scientific Reports, as recently as 2021. Mainstream science, attempting to explain these findings without invoking extraordinary events, suggested local emissions of natural combustible gases from the fault. The sincere defense of this position is based on the fact that the Dead Sea Valley is rich in natural bitumens, which could have ignited during a strong seismic shift. This explanation is consistent. It is also applied universally as a way to never ask whether a claim is true, while turning a blind eye to inconvenient data. And the data suggests that there is absolutely not enough burning bitumen or gas to form the shock metamorphosed quartz crystals found there. This extremely rare mineral forms only when ordinary quartz sand is subjected not just to high temperatures, but also to phenomenal pressure. The crystal's structure is deformed at the atomic level, leaving microscopic fracture lines that geologists call shock planes. Creating shock metamorphosed quartz requires pressures exceeding hundreds of thousands of pounds per square inch, which completely rules out any natural fire. Until now, this mineral has been found in only 2 types of locations on Earth: in craters created by giant asteroid impacts and at nuclear test sites. Quartz isn't the only problem for those trying to explain the city's destruction using traditional Bronze Age tectonic theories. In the same samples from Jordan, molten zircon was found, an incredibly hard mineral used to create refractory ceramics. To cause a zircon crystal to transition into a liquid state, a brief exposure to a temperature consistently exceeding 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit is required. No natural fire source, no pile of burning wood or boiling asphalt is capable of reaching this colossal temperature threshold. The presence of molten zircon in the dust layer means that the city was, for a fraction of a second, inside a plasma ball that vaporized rock. Laboratory studies have also revealed high concentrations of platinum, iridium, and nickel in the soil, distributed in the form of microscopic molten spheres. These heavy metals are extremely rare in their pure form on the Earth's surface, but they are abundant in many celestial bodies. The concentration of these elements in the Tel El Hammam impact layer is hundreds of times higher than the normal background level for this region of the Middle East. Scientists explicitly state in their report that such a chemical profile is a classic marker for an event of extraterrestrial impact origin. But since no impact crater exists, the only physical explanation remains the explosion of a massive space object directly in the air above the city. The article in Nature Scientific Reports states, verbatim, "The destruction layer contains a set of minerals whose formation requires temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius and extreme pressure." Translated into our units of measurement, this means that a thermal explosion of unprecedented destructive power occurred over the Jordan Valley. The evidence stored in Arizona laboratories describes the physics of a process that wiped out all life within a 15-mile radius in a matter of moments. And now, armed with these figures, we must return to the cuneiform texts that for thousands of years were considered merely a beautiful metaphor. The time has come to read the Sumerian tablets not through the eyes of a lyrical philologist, but through the eyes of a researcher of thermal anomalies. The ancient text, The Curse of Agade, has come down to us in the form of several dozen clay fragments scattered across the world's major museums. The largest and best-preserved pieces are in the collections of the British Museum in London and the University of Pennsylvania. The text was discovered in the late 19th century during excavations of the temple libraries of Nippur and dates to approximately 2 millennia before our era. Mainstream scholarship confidently asserts that this text is a classic theological lament written by priests to explain the political collapse of the Akkadian Empire. This interpretation makes sense because ancient societies did indeed always attempt to rationalize the loss of power through the lens of divine punishment for the ruler's sins. But what exactly does not fit in this interpretation is the specific technical vocabulary that the Sumerian author uses to describe the destruction. Instead of the standard list of captured temples, slain soldiers, and residents taken into slavery, the text focuses on anomalous physical phenomena. The author describes the use of the weapon of the supreme god Enlil, which descends upon the earth not as an army of soldiers, but as pure, destructive energy. The cuneiform lines detail the climate change in the region immediately following the use of this weapon, including the complete cessation of agriculture. The words chosen by the scribe resemble more the report of a survivor of a catastrophe than philosophical reflections on the political decline of a great capital. A direct translation of one of the text's key passages describes Enlil's weapon literally as fire that cannot be extinguished by water. Other lines of the document record the phrase that after the strike, the earth no longer returns to life, remaining barren. The scribe notes that a clear day turned into a dark night, describing the classic effect of sunlight being blocked by a thick cloud of ash. The text also explicitly states that the massive stone statues in the temples melted and flowed like liquid lead in a crucible. No standard bronze weapon and no army of that time could have caused the giant basalt statues to melt. It is important to note the complete absence in the text of any mention of enemy chariots besieging the city at the moment of the most devastating strike. The catastrophe is described as an instantaneous flash of light from the heavens, followed by a hurricane-force wind tearing off roofs and burning flesh. Traditional historians attribute this to an allegory of an invasion by the savage Guti tribe, who allegedly came down from the mountains and burned the city of Agade. But the Guti were ordinary people with bows and spears. They did not possess the technology to turn a clear day into darkness and melt stones. The description in the text has nothing to do with ancient warfare tactics, but it perfectly describes the physics of a high-powered thermal explosion. When we read the direct quote from the text stating that dust covered the streets so that no one could recognize them, we are seeing reality. This dust is the very same 5-foot layer of mixed ash, brick, and melted bones that archaeologists have excavated in the Jordan Valley. The ancient scribe, carving cuneiform characters into a piece of clay, was not composing high poetry about the wrath of fictional gods to entertain the public. He was trying to find the words he knew to document an event that went far beyond his understanding of the laws of nature, and his description of a fire that cannot be extinguished matches laboratory data on vitrified ceramics and molten zircon with frightening accuracy. If we combine the geological data from Tel El Hammam with the text of the Curse of a God, we are left with only one physically possible candidate. In 2021, Dr. Bunch's team explicitly stated that the cause of the ancient settlement's destruction was a space airburst of a meteorite. The official position of historians is that the Sumerian texts are in no way connected to this specific meteorite impact in Jordan. The sincere defense of this position is based on the fact that separating linguistic myths from rigorous geology is a fundamental method of any exact science. We cannot simply take a random natural disaster from one region and link it to a text from another region without evidence. But what does not add up in this rigorous position is the perfect word-for-word match between the physical parameters of an airburst and the Sumerian description. When a rocky asteroid about 200 feet in size enters the dense layers of the atmosphere at a speed of 30,000 miles per hour, it does not reach the ground. Due to the colossal air resistance, it explodes at an altitude of several miles, releasing energy exceeding 1,000 times that of the Hiroshima bomb. This explosion leaves no crater in the ground, but creates a blinding thermal flash that instantly heats the air beneath it to astronomical temperatures. It is this thermal flash that is capable of melting the zircon in clay jugs and turning the surface of brick walls into smooth glass. The thermal flash is immediately followed by a shockwave, a wall of dense air moving at a speed exceeding the speed of sound. This wave possesses sufficient kinetic energy to create impact planes in the quartz sand, that is, the very same shocked quartz. The Curse of a God describes this process with chronological precision. First comes the glow that melts, and then the storm that reduces structures to dust. The ancient author recorded the correct sequence of events of an airburst, which modern physics was only able to mathematically model at the end of the 20th century. And the probability that a Bronze Age priest accidentally guessed the physics of a meteorite impact while writing a poem tends toward absolute zero. Another striking fact concerns the environmental consequences of this event, which are documented both in laboratories and on clay tablets. During the explosion over Tel El Hammam, the shockwave lifted millions of pounds of salt from the nearby Dead Sea into the air. This salt dust was carried by a hurricane throughout the Jordan Valley, instantly destroying any chance of continued agriculture in the region. An official report in Nature Scientific Reports indicates that due to this hypersaline soil, the region remained completely uninhabited for over 600 years. This geological discovery provides us with an entirely new context for understanding ancient texts about cursed, forever barren lands. A Sumerian text describes the consequences of the impact verbatim. Grain no longer grew in the fields, plants no longer grew in the steppe. the scribe explicitly mentions salt sown on fertile fields, which was traditionally considered a metaphor for salt-tolerant weeds growing during droughts. But now we know for certain that salt physically rained down on these lands from the heavens, along with molten glass and dust. A meteorite airburst is the only mechanism in physics capable of simultaneously melting zircon in the city and blanketing thousands of acres of land with salt. And this mechanism was documented by eyewitnesses, whose accounts we have stubbornly dismissed as fabrications for the past 150 years. We have reached a critical point in our investigation where scattered fragments are coming together to form a single, terrifying picture. Molten zircon, requiring temperatures exceeding 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit, documented. Shocked quartz, formed under colossal pressure of thousands of pounds per square inch, documented. A 4,000-year-old text describing a directed thermal shock and fire that cannot be extinguished by water, translated. There is no explanation for why all three facts point in the same direction, unless they describe the same physical event. Official academic science always prefers to examine each of these anomalous elements strictly in isolation, without crossing disciplinary boundaries. Archaeologists in the field painstakingly study vitrified pots, trying to fit them into a theory of severe domestic fires or earthquakes. Geologists in laboratories analyze shock metamorphosed minerals, publishing highly specialized articles on the chemical composition of microscopic spheres in academic journals. Linguists sit in libraries and diligently translate Sumerian texts about the gods' weapons, classifying them as collections of poetic metaphors and religious myths. With such a fragmented approach, the overall picture of the event slips away, dissolving into dozens of unrelated hypotheses. But the actual physics of the event that occurred never recognizes the artificial disciplinary boundaries established by modern science. A thermal shock of incredible power left equally clear and indelible traces both in the chemical composition of the soil and in the collective human memory. When we finally decide to overlay the geological map of the destruction at Tel El Hammam onto translations of ancient cuneiform texts, their details match with frightening precision. The absence of a crater explains the lack of a description of a falling mountain, and the presence of molten glass explains the description of an unbearable glow-melting statues. The destruction was so rapid, massive, and technologically incomprehensible to the ancients that they could only call it the wrath of a divine weapon. Let's return to the quiet halls of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, located in Philadelphia. A small clay tablet, catalog number CBS 10424, still lies modestly under the dim light of the museum's glass display case. Its dense cuneiform lines have not changed one bit since the ancient scribe pressed them into the wet clay millennia ago. What has changed is only our modern ability to analyze and understand the physics of those extreme processes that were so meticulously documented on it. What seemed like romantic poetic magic to 19th century historians today has quite concrete physical parameters, measurable in degrees Fahrenheit. Official science looks at this piece of clay and sees only beautiful ancient poetry. I look at it and see a precise account of physical survival in the face of an extreme catastrophe. Perhaps drawing a parallel between the meteorite impact in Jordan and the texts from ancient Sumerian Nippur is a stretch based on the available data. But perhaps this is exactly what it so clearly and eerily resembles if we set aside our fear of stepping outside our comfort zone. We can no longer ignore direct laboratory confirmations of extreme temperatures when reading documents that describe exactly the same temperatures. The question of what exactly destroyed these ancient civilizations remains open to honest investigation. But the facts unearthed from the ground can no longer be hidden back under a layer of academic complacency. This clay tablet, covered in ancient script, is right now in a locked glass display case,